I think it's time.
Sorry.
Yeah. Now doing a recording. All right. So we will start our presentation. And I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone and thank you for joining the Keswick Ridge Historical Society for our annual History Speaks series. My name is Evelyn Fiddler and I'm a member of the Keswick Ridge Historical Society, and today I'm going to be your moderator. Now, today we are pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Leah Grandy, and to hear her presentation on researching Loyalist stories using the Loyalist collection to recover the lives of New Brunswick Loyalists. And our presentation today will be followed by our question period. And if you have any questions during the presentation, write them down in the chat, and we'll address them either during the presentation or at the end, more than likely at the end. And just a few notes on Zoom etiquette. Please leave your microphones on mute and put all your questions in chat. We will address the chat questions first, but we will also open the floor for questions after we've addressed the chat questions. And if you're in a distracting environment, if you could turn off your camera as to not to distract from the presentation. And as you just saw, the presentation is going to be recorded. It's being recorded now. And that's because we want to share it with people that have missed it. And it will be posted on our social media and also on our website. And that'll take a couple days for us to edit it. And remember to go to Facebook and like us. And then you can find out all about our upcoming events and projects. And we're always looking for new members. And because we now have the capability of doing our monthly meetings through Zoom, or we'll be moving to a combination, anyone from anywhere can join us. Just get in touch with one of us on the contact us on the Historical Society page. Now I am going to welcome our speaker today, and I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Leah Grandy. And Leah is a Special Collections Assistant in the University of New Brunswick Archives and Special Collections, and holds a PhD in history. Her specialties include the Atlantic provinces and New Brunswick history, Loyalist, colonial naming practices, paleography, working with primary sources, and newspaper. And her presentation, I gave the title earlier, but it's Researching Loyalist Stories and Using the Loyalist Collection to Recover the Lives of New Brunswick Loyalists. And this presentation is going to feature an introduction to the digital project, New Brunswick Loyalist Journeys, with a focus on examining the stories of Elizabeth Green and Samuel Richard Wilson, as well as a discussion of the research process of using the Loyalist collection to recover the lives of New Brunswick Loyalists. Now, on a personal note, I first met Dr. Grandy a few years back now, and it was through the blog post that she was writing in the Loyalist Connections, which is really informative, well-researched, and I've used them in different presentations. I've used them for resource sources at King's Landing. And then Dr. Leah joined the board of directors at King's Landing and become part of the collections committee. And in recent years, she and her son are frequent visitors to King's Landing. I always like to meet them on the road, all smiling, everybody's happy. It's always refreshing. So welcome, Leah, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm excited to do this presentation today. It's always nice to share something I'm interested in with other people that are interested in the same thing. So, and I'm just in Mazerel Settlement. I've been there for 10 years, so I'm kind of neighbors. So I'm always over in Keswick, and it's always neat when I'm researching Loyalists to see the physical connection there. And I'm sure I'll be over there soon, eagerly awaiting Skinny's seasonal opening. So. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and start with a PowerPoint here. All right, so we're seeing the title of my presentation. All good there, Russ? Yep, okay. So I'll start off, if everybody, it sounds like some of you are already kind of familiar who Loyalists are, and most people that live in New Brunswick probably have heard of them. But if you haven't, we're talking about people that supported the British cause during the American Revolution. And those that came to New Brunswick in very significant numbers, those would be considered refugees. So many settled in the maritime provinces in the late 18th century. So most of them came around 1783, right at the end of the revolution, many coming out of New York. Um, and the big thing about what I want to convey and what we're doing with our digital project is to show the variety of loyalists. I think maybe people have this idea in their head of what a loyalist is, but it's a huge range of people. And I thought I grabbed some images here to show you some of the range. It was women, there were Black loyalists. This is Samuel Cook here, he is a minister. Joseph Brant. In Upper Canada, there's Indigenous loyalists. Samuel Denny Street, he's a lawyer in Fredericton. Now, not to say that we don't have all that many portraits of loyalists. So a lot of them didn't have portraits, as you'll see when we get into the story maps, but these are just some representations of loyalists. There are loyalist children. That's Jonathan Odell, quite a famous loyalist. Hannah Ingram, the Ingram House at King's Landing, and she famously wrote one of the only child loyalist accounts that we have. So today I'm going to introduce you to the Loyalist collection if you haven't heard of it before. And then kind of in tangent, I'm going to show you what types of documents we recommend to use in researching Loyalists, and then how you would get started researching Loyalists. So I'll show you some examples of really important types of documents that we use in the collection. And then at the end, I'm going to show you New Brunswick Loyalist Journeys project, which shows you kind of the end result of what you can do with looking at those kind of sources. And there's 2 loyalists in our project that have connections to the Keswick area. Elizabeth Green had land right in Keswick. And then Samuel Richard Wilson had land in Queensbury, just to the other side of us, the Mactaquac River. So the Loyalist collection, if anything I say is of interest, I'll give you this information again at the end, but you can find everything about the Loyalist collection on the UNB Library website at loyalist.lib.unb.ca. It's got the catalog and all the neat extra features I'm going to tell you about today. And if you are interested in researching Loyalists, the good news is this is the largest primary source collection, so original documents from the period in North America. I would say probably the only other largest collection would be the National Archives in the UK. And so the collection is centered on the experiences of Loyalists, and it's kind of how we approach research to Loyalists by dividing their lives up into 3 general periods, and it's kind of the range of material we have in the collection too, is their lives before the revolution, during the revolution, and then the period of resettlement after the revolution. So the time period that the collection covers is about 1740 to 1870. So we have stuff in there that would be applicable to people that have ancestors that weren't loyalists as well. It covers what I call the Atlantic world. So we have documents from what was called Great Britain at the time, all the different North American colonies, the American colonies, early Canada, and then also the Caribbean as well, because some loyalists went there as well. So we have things in there. People use it not just for researching Loyalists, but for many topics. And like Evelyn, even though I research Loyalists, I have no Loyalist ancestors. I do have a planter ancestor that was in a Loyalist regiment in Nova Scotia. And so the focus is the period of the American Revolution. So we're talking about the 1770s. And then we also want to look at the early years of Loyalist settlement in British North America. So we have stuff that covers usually the first generation of Loyalists, and then a couple generations afterwards as well. So how would you go about starting researching the Loyalists? I mean, it's a long time ago. Any of you that have done genealogy research, it can be very complicated. So we always recommend when you're doing research that you start with secondary sources. So that's something that somebody else has written about the topic or the period. And we tell students to do this. We tell family researchers, any type of researchers, because if you just start diving into documents that were created at the time, you may not understand and you may miss something. So it's always good to start with reputable secondary sources. Then you kind of even know what questions you need to ask, right? Before you dive in. And the best way to start is we have like what we would call nominal indexes. So nominal just meaning names. So you have lists of short biographies or short biographical information that would maybe get you started. So then you would get into the primary sources. And I've used that term already. So that's what the Loyalist collection is, a primary source collection. So those are documents that are created at the time of the period that you're studying. So it could be letters, newspapers, diaries, government documents, anything like that. And we know a lot of research now, especially genealogy, is done online. You just, of course, have to be very cautious, as we all know, about online, what's online. There's good stuff on there, and then there's also stuff that might lead you astray as well. And you can get primary and secondary online. Evelyn mentioned our blog, and I'll show you, we have a post that we made during the pandemic because so many people are doing online research during the pandemic on what we recommend as the reputable online sources to use for Loyalist research. Thankfully now a lot of libraries and archives are opening up again. One of the first ways I start researching Loyalists, once I have some basic information, is once I figured out what community they came from in the American colonies, I tried to find an archive, a library, a local historical association, like the Keswick Historical Society, and reach out to that institution to see if they can give me some local expertise on that individual. Because they know where to find the type of documents I need for that area, because it's different in every area, every province, every state. And I've had really great luck with that. And because it's Loyalist studies is really increasing in interest in the United States. As you probably could imagine, there's more concentration on the Patriot side of things, but just in recent years, there's been a real surge of interests in Loyalists because in some communities, there is a huge exodus of people and they have this one side of their story in this community, the other end of their stories here, and they would like to know about what happened to this population as well. So I've made some very great virtual friends, historical friends, doing this type of research. So there's a number of primary documents that we use specifically for researching New Brunswick Loyalists. Now, some of these that are up here are going to be useful for any type of biographical research that you're doing, like wills, probate records, so associated with death, church records, you'd probably think of immediately. Newspapers, always very useful. But then there's some here that are specifically useful for Loyalists, like Loyalist claims, which I'll explain more about, and the Winslow papers. So I do help researchers all the time, genealogists and other types of researchers. And one of my biggest recommendations to everybody getting started is do not get hung up on the spelling of your person's name you're researching, because in the 18th century and even the 19th century, names varied greatly. And even people themselves did not write a standard spelling of their names, particularly surnames. For example, this is the last name in my family, Coolin, and I've come across it that many different ways. Often recorders in New Brunswick, like people that were recording court records or church records, were Anglophones. And so if they're hearing somebody, and there was first generation Irish Gaelic people here, Acadians, German people, that sometimes they're recording that name the way they hear it, not the way that it would be spelt in the original language. So that's where you get a name like Doherty becomes Doherty written down, or there's definitely, those of you that have Acadian ancestors probably know there's a anglicization in the spelling as well. Often I come across names are spelled differently in the same document, two different spellings in the same document. With Gaelic surnames, so you're Irish and Scottish, you may have the O there, or it may be dropped, or Mac or Mick or or just an M with an apostrophe. And also more so with women than men, but sometimes you'll come across nicknames, people recorded with nicknames rather than their full given name. And just to show you an example here, this is one of the Loyalists I researched from York County, Abraham Vanderbeck, and he was of Dutch descent from Pennsylvania and, or not Pennsylvania, sorry, New Jersey. And this is just a sampling of how his name appeared on documents that I've come across. So all different spellings. So you kind of have to think creatively. And sometimes you have to say the name out loud and be like, couldn't that be that name written phonetically? So I'm going to get into the Loyalist collection now and talk about some of the different types of documents we have there. We're located on the 5th floor of the Harriet Irving Library. We actually just moved the collection up, finished moving it this week. And the collection is divided up into sections that are kind of useful. So we have church, family, military, public, that would be our biggest section, special collections, and we also have a great reference book collection as well, of which is a great place to get started with Loyalist research. So our collection is pretty much entirely on microfiche and microfilm. It is not digital. In the catalog, if we know of somebody that's digitized this material, we will put a link there. And you might think, if you've done some genealogy, maybe you've already used microfiche and microfilm. So there's microfiche and microfilm. We have scanners here, so you can actually do digital copies of images. And you might think that this is microfilms, and actually this microfilm equipment on the left, we actually have this machine still. If you take a microfilm from the 1950s and put it on a machine from the 1950s, it still works. But there's digital historical products out there from 10 years ago that no longer work. So it is still a great source. And we're happy to help people use that microfilm that haven't before. So church records, that's definitely a go-to place for to get started with research, because for the 18th century, there wouldn't really have been government registries of births, deaths, and marriages. So you have to go to churches for that. And we do have a copy of the Anglican parishes of Douglas and Bright, which is the originals, and there's a microfilm copy at the provincial archives as well. And I believe the New Brunswick Genealogy Society is working to put a lot of that online as well, if you're a member of that society. So church records, a lot of people use them for the baptisms, marriages, burials, but there's also other kinds of interesting information in there about establishment of churches, just the general functioning of the church, the vestry records, types of missionary work. So we have within the Loyalist collections, the denominations we cover: Presbyterian, Catholic, Anglican, Lutheran, Methodist, and Baptist. So when you get started with church records, it's important to try and figure out, kind of in your initial research, what community the person you're researching is from, and what probable denomination they have. So, okay, I'm looking for Anglican church records for the parish of Bright, and then that's how you get started. So this one here is actually a page. It's got baptisms from the parish of Douglas and Bright. So you can see some names here: Rogers, Tomlinson, King, Cox, Staples. I saw Rose Staples on there, and we have some of the locations here: Tay Creek, Douglas, Bright. When you're dealing with the early colonial years in New Brunswick and the Loyalist settlers, we're mainly talking about the Anglican Church. That was pretty much the only church here. So some of the Loyalists I researched were not Anglican, but their marriages appear in, and baptisms of their family appear in, the Anglican Church records, because that was the only church available. So we have, as part of the Loyalist collection, there's a database we created, that we call the Mary Ann Gray Audie database. She was a very early 20th century historian of Queens County, and she had transcribed early Anglican church records centered around Gagetown. So this covers the early years of Loyalist settlement and with baptisms, deaths, and marriages. And you can have, there's really interesting notes in there sometimes about cause of death, the race of the person, and you can get that online. It's very a quick lookup. I didn't see any directly listed as Keswick, but there is definitely a lot from York County. So the next section of records we have is family records. So this could be basically anything that was created by private individuals. And so we have collections from a lot of Loyalist families or prominent individuals that produced a lot. So we have things like account books, personal papers, a lot of correspondence and letters, memoirs, diaries, all that would end up there. And this is something part of the collection we use quite often. So we, for example, here's a little sample. We have the papers of Benedict Arnold, who had, I think most people know he had a St. John connection, but he also was in Fredericton for a while. He had land on Waterloo Row. This is one of my favorite documents from the family section of our records. A visit from St. Nicholas, or 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, is often known this poem from the Adele family papers. There's an authorship controversy that surrounds this document, and I think most people say Clement Clark Moore wrote it, but there's a whole scholarship around who might have written it. And this is a copy that was probably written by one of Jonathan Odell's daughters, copied out, because they were actually friends from before they migrated here with the Moore family. And so this copy of the poem was a very early copy, and it has slight variations from kind of the standard one now that make it really interesting. I also like to use this one. You can see it's quite hard to read, and I'm not covering this today, but one of the things I do with students here is I give workshops on paleography, looking at historical handwriting, because a lot of students don't do cursive writing now, a lot of history students. So I give them a little bit of tips and a little bit of a boost to get them into reading historical cursive documents. And this is one of the ones that we use sometimes. Here's a really neat one as well from the John Saunders papers, also very prominent New Brunswick Loyalist. It's a coded letter. So it written in says there was a lot of Loyalists that ended up in New Brunswick that were involved in espionage activity. So I mentioned the Edward Winslow papers. He again was a very prominent Central Loyalist, and his papers we have available. We have his original papers in UNB Archives and Special Collections, and they've all been digitized and are searchable online. And so that's a great quick resource to use, and especially for the Fredericton area, but throughout New Brunswick. So you can search by name or subjects. And this was just one I quickly pulled up here. If you can read, it says New York volunteers settled on their land at Madame Kishavee, August 1785. So that would be the Keswick River, one of the early name variations. And when you're doing research from this period, you have to be aware of the place name changes. I know the Keswick Historical Society probably know the history of the name, but around here, of course, you're going to have a lot of Wolastoqey names that were kind of changed over time and modified, and that would be an example of one that changed over time. So we have a list of settlers here and how many people were with them. One of the family papers that we have that from your area would be the Clements family, and they were Loyalists from Cortland Manor, New York, which is actually where Elizabeth Green, that I'm going to talk about, was from as well. And he was in the King's American Regiment, and they ended up settling in Douglas. And so this is one of the maps that we have here from his family papers and some of the things. So we have the St. John River down here, and we can see right here, we have the Reverend Samuel Cook, who is considered, I guess, the founder of the Anglican Church in New Brunswick, and he's one of the Loyalists that we've profiled on our project. And also, interestingly, these great maps were made by George Sproul, who was the first Surveyor General of New Brunswick. And he's also one of the Loyalists that we've covered in the York County biographies. And his maps are just, they stand up really well. You can still figure out, he was so good. He was kind of brilliant at mapping that these maps, you can still understand them today. I mean, you have to use them in combination with a modern map. And also I'll be showing you some examples of land grant maps that were more from the mid 20th century. And if you use those in conjunction, you can figure out where these original grants were. But also in your area, one of the tricky things when I was dealing with York County is the Mactaquac Dam changed the landscape immensely sometimes. So you have to kind of imagine what it looked like before as well. And here's another example of a map here. We have, so this would be the Keswick area right here in the red box, another one by Sproul. And here's the grant of Samuel Richard Wilson that I'm going to be showing you when we get to the digital maps. So his land was more in Queensbury, about where I think the Mactaquac Baptist Church is now. And so this is an example of probate records. So those are anything surrounding a person's death. We have great information there. And so this was from the Clements papers as well. And if you can get probate records, that tells you a lot about a person's life. So moving on to military records, many of the male loyalists who came to New Brunswick would have had a military career, usually as part of a loyalist provincial regiment. And so they would have been Americans, but they joined kind of this extra part of the British Army here in North America. And those are some of the different regiments that have come up so far, like the King's American Rangers, the Guides and Pioneers we'll be talking about, New Jersey Volunteers, and a lot of those settled in and around the Fredericton area. So for military records, they could be different types of official papers, journals, officers kept maps. The military is always creating maps. I'm going to show you an example of a muster roll. Papers surrounding garrisons. Also in the military, sometimes they have the actual settlement lists of where people were granted land after the war, things surrounding pensions. Also Hessians, who were the German mercenaries that some of them settled as well in Canada, what became Canada. So the muster roll here is probably one of the most important military documents when you're researching a loyalist. And what it basically is listing a group of soldiers, a company, where they were at a certain time and what their condition was. And usually that was for pay purposes and just accounting for where everybody was. So where this first era you see, this is Abraham Vanderbeck. So the person I mentioned I researched before, and he had quite a long military career in the New Jersey Volunteers throughout the whole war, about 7 years. And so we see his name appear there, so I can track where he went. And that's partially how I was able to map him for our digital project, because he had a really good collection of I could follow him through these muster rolls. So we have their rank over here. So we would have the highest officers at the top. So you have the commissioned officers. Those would be like your captain and your lieutenant, your ensign, adjutant. But then Vanderbeck was a sergeant. So that's a non-commissioned officer. That would be sergeants and corporals. And then we have all their names listed here. And this column here is where you can sometimes find the most interesting information. So that has a note about them sometimes if they're injured, if they're sick, if they have been taken prisoner, if they died. That's where you're going to find it in that column there. And then also here, it's important, pretty standard that you have a date and a location of where this was taken. So this was taken at Staten Island in 1781. The other big papers from the military that people use quite often in Loyalist research, some people call them the Carleton papers, or they're officially called the British Headquarter papers. So these are all collection of papers that the military produced during the American Revolution. So this is just an example here. It's a list of English prisoners aboard the ship Tiger at Philadelphia. So there's all kinds of different information there, and it's actually all indexed, so you can look up names to see where a person you're researching might appear, and it could be anything. Like we most often see people on kind of support lists, like while they're in New York waiting to migrate, they're receiving pay, or widows that are receiving pay because they've lost their husbands in the war. This is one of my favorite types of documents from, and it's just fun, I wanted to show you this from our military collection. It's a letter of marque. So this is a license for piracy, which many were issued during the American Revolution by different sides. So this gives the right of this ship that was going to bring cargo. The ship is called the Brilliant, and it's coming out of the port of Bristol to attack enemy ships and take them and then take their cargo as compensation. And we actually have we've had whole classes that on piracy and privateering that have used this part of the collection in their studies. So the public records are probably the biggest section of records that we have, and they cover a big expansive geographically. So we have Great Britain, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, also what was called Upper Canada and Lower Canada. We even have recently acquired records from Jamaica. And we have all the American colonies as well covered. So we have material from those American colonies before the Revolution that would be helpful to do that into the research. One of the types of records within the public records that I work with the most are the county court records, which I find really interesting, and we have indexed those, so they're easy to search as well. So this is an example from York County from 1790. So the county courts did things like you would when you think of a court. They did do trials for not very serious crimes. Usually it's like assault, petty larceny, most often assault. And we can see here, this is like just recording. This is the standard recording of how the sessions opened. And we have we see Edward Winslow there, Beverly Robinson Jr., another very prominent Loyalist family. And these were the justices of the peace, or the esquire justices that made the decisions. But also you can find in those court records, tavern licenses were in there very regularly, teachers' licenses. You had a lot of regulations about fishing, livestock, and also road planning was a huge thing, especially in the 1780s, 90s, and into the 1800s. And also you have lists of parish officers, which you're very likely often to find Loyalist settlers among the parish officers. Now, the parish officers didn't have to do with the church. It's just talking about the parish as a district, like a geographical district. So here's an example from Prince William from 1789. So there's particular people that are assigned to be parish officers. Some of them got some compensation, but most of it, you're just doing it as a public service. So one of my favorite positions here, and I'm giving you a hint here with this picture, it's kind of hard to read, but at the bottom here, you have hog reeves. And these were people that if there was livestock, particularly pigs running loose, because they did a lot of damage to crops, that they would have to go and round up that livestock. Some of the other positions here, roads are very important. You have commissioners of roads. You have overseers of the poor, right? Because since there's no social services in place, they make sure that the poor are taken care of if needed. Surveyor of roads, they're kind of below the commissioners and they kind of plan out roads directly. Assessors, they're going to look at how much you have to pay for taxes. And then the constables and collectors go and get the taxes. We also have the clerk that does recording. We have a pound keeper. So the pound keeper is the guy when the hog reeve catches the pig, He takes it to the pound keeper, and then you have to pay to get it back from the pound keeper and make sure you keep it fenced in. And then also we have fence viewers. So they're the ones that are making sure that your fences are are well constructed, so your livestock's not going to get out, and also that they're constructed on not on your neighbor's property. So it's interesting to show that these were very important roles at this time. But also it's a great resource. I think almost every Loyalist male that I've researched in York County has appeared as as a parish officer because there were so many positions. A really important type of document we use for researching Loyalist is the Loyalist claim. And what these claims were, they wrote these petitions to the British government for compensation for their role in protecting the Loyalist cause in America, because a lot of them had lost everything, their property, their means of making a living. And we're talking about all different levels of people, from people that were very wealthy to people that almost had nothing. But all of them were entitled to write these claims to the Loyalist Claims Commission in London. And a lot of people in New Brunswick did do that. So, and it gives you a lot of great information about what they did before the war and during the war. With this type of document, though, you have to be aware that they're trying to present the best picture of themselves. So sometimes I've definitely come across ones where I know from other sources that they're fudging the details a little bit in them to make themselves sound better. This one here is from Abraham Vanderbeck that I mentioned before. Some of them are very short, just a page or two, and some of them are very extensive and have all kinds of witness statements and lists of property, all kinds of information. So they vary a bit there. So he's just basically telling the best he can about what he did during the war, that at the very early period of the late rebellion, being greatly persecuted by the king's enemies, he was obliged to abandon his property and seek protection within the British lines. He joined the New Corps, so that was the New Jersey Volunteers, and cheerfully served during the whole war, exerting himself to the utmost to prove useful. And he was, in the course of such service, taken prisoner, and while in captivity, treated with great inhumanity. And this was really common. A lot of the military loyalists I've researched were prisoners of war for a period of time. Vanderbeck ended up settling on Waterloo Row, and he opened the first tavern in Fredericton. So I thought I'd show you a page to show kind of the variation of the claim of Elizabeth Green. So she's the one I'm going to be talking about more in regards to Keswick. So this is her listing of things she lost that were in her house that when she left New York, that she had to leave. And you can tell she didn't have a lot compared to a lot of people that made these claims. She has 2 beds, 4 chains, and 2 trammels. So it's like a fishing net, as far as I know. 2 chests, a pot and a kettle, 2 milk cows, 2 young cattle, 2 calves, a house, and her husband's wages to be in Emmerich's corps. So what she was asking for was very minimal compared to what a lot of people were asking for. And a lot of these claims were, I would say most of them were not very successful at all unless they had political connections. So a lot of them were not granted compensation. On the New Brunswick side, land petitions are really useful for getting some biographical information on people. And these land petitions the originals are held at the provincial archives, and there's an index online where you can look up names to see if the person you're researching has either a petition or a grant. So the petition is asking for land, the grant is saying, yeah, you've got the land. So sometimes the petitions are from a large group of people, like this one here. We have all these signatures at the end. So this is from the inhabitants of Jimsag Creek. So again, looking at the name change, you can probably figure out that's Jimsag. Or you could have a petition that's from one specific person. And this land petition here is from Samuel Richard Wilson, that I'm going to be talking about more. He produced a lot of land petition documents. And if it's from one person, you're more likely going to get more biographical information. The last part of the Loyalist collection is called Special Collections, and that's really just anything that didn't fit in another category. Usually it's a collection of work from another institution, like a museum or an archive. I thought this one was kind of neat here. I pulled this. So Philadelphia, 1763, so leading up to the war, and that's actually a letter from Benjamin Franklin. Another great resource, and this is our other big part of our microforms collection, is newspapers. We have over 950 microform titles, all from around the world, but we also have the largest New Brunswick newspaper collection here at UNB Libraries. And you can see what titles we have if you go to newspapers.lib.unb.ca. And also with those microform titles, we actually have a lot of digital full text content as well, which part of our collection was we had a large group, they're in a warehouse now, of hard copy newspapers. And we digitized all those. They're not all up yet, but they all will be, and that it's fully searchable. The Daily Mail is a really good one that covers a lot of the 19th century, and so it's very searchable and really high quality results when you get it. The main newspaper for the Loyalist period, which was the official government newspaper, was the Royal Gazette. So this is the example from 1785. And the actual original editor of the paper, Christopher Sauer, he is one of the new Loyalists we profiled in our project for St. John County. So if you want to know more about him, you can read more about him as well. So there wasn't a lot of New Brunswick newspapers during the Loyalist settlement period, but there was a lot of American colonial newspapers. And we have a product that you can use here in the library called America's Historical Newspapers, where you can search and find some really good stuff. I was able to find one of the Loyalists that I researched, Alexander Fairchild. I was able to find a physical description of him when he escaped. He was imprisoned for being a Loyalist in Connecticut, and he escaped from prison. And he actually, I have a description of him because I was able to find this newspaper article. He's about 6 feet high, dark colored hair, which he wears clubbed, so a ponytail turned up, had on a blue coat, a red waistcoat, a claret colored surcoat, and leather breeches. So this is quite amazing. As I said, we don't have a lot of physical representations of Loyalists, and so for him, that's the closest I could get. So newspapers always a wealth of information. And probably the most common question I get from people doing Loyalist or early 19th century research on individuals is, can I have their obituary? And obituary probably isn't the right term to use. That's kind of a 20th century term. Here's an example here from one of the Loyalists we've researched, Sarah Hanford. And it's more of a death announcement. That's what I would call it if it appears in the paper. If the person was very well known or there was an unusual death, sometimes there was more written about the person, but it tends to be pretty brief and not have a lot of biographical information. As you can see, hers has some religious sentiments there. And you can see that the common term for widows in this time was called a relict. So she was the relict of Mr. Thomas Hanford. So we can find those, just don't expect to have like the way we have today, like, a compact biography of the person's life. And as Evelyn mentioned, we have the Atlantic Loyalist Connections blog, which we've had for about 6 years now. And we have staff writes posts, and we've had a great group of student assistants, and also sometimes undergrad classes have been involved in writing blog posts, as well as researchers that have used the collection have written posts. And all the topics are centered on this revolutionary period and the Atlantic world. But on the blog, you'll find a variety of topics, and a lot of them are kind of give you research help, different advice. Some of them talk about specific documents in the collection, and people kind of looked at if they could find out more about that document, and talk about their own research experiences. And I'll just show you when I pop over to the website. One recent one that I did was looking at what kind of research you could do using graveyards. So before I go over to our website, I'm going to just give you a brief introduction to the New Brunswick Loyalist Journeys project. So what it is a story mapping project. And it's a way to take biographies that would normally just be written and published maybe online or in a book just with text, to make them more interactive, to make them more visual, and really to make you understand how the paths of their lives went. So this uses a technology called GIS software, geographic information software, so mapping software, and it's from a company called Esri. And you can access the story maps from our website. Just there's a button on the side to go to story maps. And so how we came about this project is we wanted to do a biographical project to show what you could do with the material in the collection. And we thought this kind of gave an added value to that, because it recreates their lives visually. So really, it brings the impact home of what their experiences were. And also it worked really well because the Loyalist had this very geographic component to what they did. Some of the Loyalists have definitely traveled more widely than I have at a time when we think of the transportation technology as not being very advanced. They traveled very widely. And we wanted to show documents from the collection. And as part of the project, we actually have linked PDFs of primary documents, like some of the ones just like I've been showing you. Those are available off the project, and that's where we've been using it a lot as an educational tool. We've had undergrad classes and high school classes using those as a way to get into using primary historical documents. And this was just a new subject matter for this technology. It hadn't been used a lot in an academic way or for a historical topic. And we actually won awards for our York County section after that was released, for having the best story map. I think it was January 2017 or 18 in globally. And it was a huge collaboration. It's quite a large project. It took a lot of people to helping out. So we have staff, that's me, and Christine Jack, she's a manager of microforms at the time, and Siobhan Hanratty was our technical expert. She's our GIS librarian. And here's one of the students. We had a lot of student assistants working on the project, both on the technical end and doing research and writing. This is Zoe Jackson, and she contributed quite a bit. And again, we had support from other institutions that really helped us out, like the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, and then institutions from, especially from the United States, but also from the UK as well. So the project, it encompasses right now 30 biographies of Loyalists. And our first section was York County, which we released in 2017. And it made sense to start here because we're at the University of New Brunswick, Fredericton, so it made sense to start right here. And so we did 10 Loyalists. And one of the questions I get a lot are, oh, are you going to do all the Loyalists? And I'm like, well, maybe if I had a small army and 1,000 years, I would. But so it is a very selective representation of Loyalists. For example, for York County, we kind of picked people to fit criteria, which was they had to be here for a certain time, be in these certain boundaries, and we still had about 1,000 candidates we could have used. We also had, so it says 10 out of 1,000 candidates that we picked, and we still had to pick people that had enough documentation to kind of flesh out their life, so we could tell their story. We have tried to pick for each of the counties a range of people. for our first attempt, we've gotten better at researching through each of the counties, and for the next two counties, which we did in tangent, Kings County and St. John County, we were able to do maybe some less prominent people, as some of our students became more experienced with research. So I'm going to head over to the maps for a minute, hopefully. Okay. And I'm just going to reshare my screen. Let me see this one here. Okay. So you're seeing the Loyalist collection screen now, Russ? Good. Okay. So this is the Loyalist collection page. So loyalist.lib.unb.ca. So a lot of the stuff I've been talking about you can find here. You have a search bar right off the bat. Now, what I want to warn you, if I have enticed you and you want to do Loyalist research now, if you put your Loyalist name in there, you may not get a result. That does not mean that there's not information on them in there. Because the collection is very, very wide and dense. If it was on paper, it would probably take a whole floor of the library. When you search, you're getting information that we've put in there. So for names, unless your person created, like was a very prominent Loyalist family and created a collection, or if they were corresponding with one of those Loyalists, you probably won't see them in the result. But there's lots of other ways to find Loyalists within the collection if their name doesn't just pop up. So we have over here the blog we've been talking about, the Atlantic Loyalist Connections. So here's a post I recently did on researching in graveyards and what you can learn. Because I know probably you guys are all interested in history, so you've probably taken a poke around graveyards at different times. And also here you will find the remote research entry I was telling you about to help you with credible sources for Loyalist research available online. Right, and also as well over here we have under databases, that's the Marianne Gray Audie database that I mentioned that you can find centered on Gagetown births, deaths, and marriages. For story maps, right here on the side. So you'll get to this page. Now the story maps, this is just an image of the story mapping project. The project actually lives on the software company's website. So if you click on this, it will bring you through to the actual website. We recommend for this because it's got a lot of pictures, a lot of information in writing that it doesn't work very well on a phone. You need like a laptop or a desktop to get the full effect. And it does have a lot of information in there. So I'm just going to be giving you a brief run through today of a couple of people with Keswick area connections. So right now we're on the overview page. And you can scroll down and it gives you an introduction. And the introduction is actually written by Dr. Bunny Huskins, who is doing one of the next presentations for the Society. And she also does Loyalist research. And we also have here more about the project, if you want to know more about the background to it, and a glossary. If you're new to Loyalist research, we find there's terms that are really particular to this period and Loyalists. So this kind of gives you a start with that terminology. So along the top here, you'll see we have our 3 counties that we've completed. We hope to do more counties in the future, but it takes time and people. And definitely the pandemic held us up getting the 2 counties out, St. John and Kings County, which were just released in November. So York County is what we're going to look at today. And if you click on the county, then you'll get an additional layer of tabs here with your 10 Loyalists. So we're going to first look at Elizabeth Green here. Now for each county, we've tried to do at least one female Loyalist. They're a lot harder to do. If any of you have done genealogical research yet or historical research, women are very much harder to research through most time periods and places than men. The women that we've been able to recover, usually it's because they were widowed once or even twice, and that is the case with Elizabeth Green. And Tilton was her second married name. She was widowed twice. So then the widows produce their own documents, and you know more about them. Um, all right, so she was from, as I mentioned before, and our first page here, we have a signature for every loyalist, including her. We were able to get a signature off documents. And your first page here, you're going to see all kinds of points associated with her life. And these maps are movable. You can work with them, and all these dots are points in her life, and you can click on them and see what that point represents. So that's Fort Cumberland. Oh, so like Olac, that's where she originally migrated to. And on each map, the points are color coded to show you what type of life event they represent. So this first map here, which is very beautiful, it's a historical map from the David Rumsey map collection, which is a good resource too if you're looking for historical maps. We use this in a couple parts of the each biography, but it's not. It was created at the time of the American Revolution, so it is matching up with points underneath, modern points, but it's not the most accurate. Sometimes if you zoom in, you get points out in the ocean when they're meant to be in a coastal town. So we just use those at the beginning, and then you'll see we use other types of maps, more modern maps as we go on. So each biography is set up with chapters of the person's life. Sometimes we were able to write much more about a certain person, sometimes less. And you can either skip ahead to different chapters of their life, you can scroll down and go through it, or on these points over here, you can actually skip ahead to different points in their life as well. So Elizabeth Green was from Cortland Manor in Westchester County, New York. A lot of Loyalists came from there. Her first husband was Thomas, and she had two sons, Henry and Isaac, and they were small tenant farmers. And very rarely buildings have survived from these loyalists, especially as we saw from her when we looked at her claims. She didn't have a lot, but we actually had a student that painted one of the tenant houses that they still have as a museum in Cortland Manor as a representation of what it might have looked like where she originally lived. And during the war, her husband Thomas went to the British side, and she stayed on the farm to look after it, which was pretty common. But then early on in the war, she only had a few cows, and her couple cows were taken from her. And then in 1778, she was driven off the farm and had to go to New York City. So then we have records of her allowance being given to her as a Loyalist refugee in New York. Her sons and husbands were originally in the Loyalist Regiment, the Guides and Pioneers, which a lot of them went to the Keswick area, were resettled in the Keswick area. And so Guides and Pioneers were kind of a different regiment in that, well, you can see from the term guides, they were guiding people. They were local people that were guiding the British Army. And then the pioneer part refers to kind of an engineering component, like building roads and surveying. So they may not have necessarily been kind of frontline soldiers. Then her husband joined the Emmerich Chasseurs, and then Delancey's brigade, but he died during the war. So then she ended up going with her two sons to migrating to New Brunswick. They actually took a boat from New York to Fort Cumberland and then came to the Fredericton area. And so they got land with the Guides and Pioneers in what was called Block 3, and that also went over to Queensbury as well. And so Queensbury and Bright parishes. So originally she was living with her sons. They were the ones that were given land. But then in 1784, her son Isaac drowned in the St. John River, which that actually happened to a lot of early Loyalists. They drowned in the river. So after he drowned, she actually petitioned for the land that he had been granted to take it over. And she was given that 100 acres plus another 200 acres. From what I can tell, looking at the maps, I believe the plot of land would have been right about where Riverview Orchard is, a little bit towards Ridge Cedar. That was what they were originally granted. The map you're looking at here is a land grant map, and these are held by the provincial archives, but we have digital ones are available online, and these are very detailed. And if you look at where the dot is, it doesn't say her name. It says a different name, Nathan Smith. And that was because neither her nor her sons were able to develop the land within usually the period they were given was about 5 years to turn it into a farm. So she wasn't able to do that. The first time when her time was up, she repetitioned for the land again, but she wasn't able to turn it into a farm, and then the land gets escheated. So the land is taken away and granted to somebody else. So what we found is these provincial land grant maps actually show the first person, not necessarily that was granted the land, but the person that was first able to develop the land. And this would be this case with the other loyalists we're looking at as well. And so here's another one of George Sproul's maps. And this would be one of the original grant maps. So you can see her name in this one. You see 23 right here, Widow Elizabeth Green. And so you can see this is the Keswick River up here and the islands down here. Okay. So what she ended up doing was remarrying another loyalist who was also a veteran of the British Army called Clayton Tilton. He was from New Jersey. So they married in 1805, and he had land in Musquash, so outside of St. John, and you can see his name here by the dot. But unfortunately, he was murdered in 1808 when he tried to intercept deserters from the British Army. So she was a widow a second time. And at that point, she moved to St. John. And her remaining son, Henry, we believe, was there as well. But we have records from her because she was pretty much destitute at this point. She had had a fall, so she was physically unable to make money to pay for herself. But then, so she had a few petitions to the province trying to look for some sort of allowance. But then toward the end of her life, she withdrew her petitions because her son was able to assist her, and she ended up dying in 1827. Now, at the end of each map, there's you can click here and you can get another section that gives you all the bibliographical information. So all the footnotes, it's all footnoted. The information, if you think, oh, that would be relevant to what I'm doing, it has bibliography, footnotes, and also all references for where the images came from. All right, I'm going to talk about one more loyalist here. And he's one of my favorites. This is one of the people that I researched myself early on in the project, Samuel Richard Wilson. We don't know a lot about his background. He was likely born in Ireland and was a veteran of the British Army. So by the time of the Revolution, he had already served in the British Army as an officer, and he had retired and received half pay because that's what would happen. So he got half the pay he was when he's in active duty. But he must have decided for some reason that America was the way to go during the war, and he came to Philadelphia in 1777. He had problems along the way. He had his ship was attacked by a privateer outside Boston, and they took all his trunk, all the things he had with him. When he got to Philadelphia, he joined a short-lived Loyalist regiment called the Roman Catholic Volunteers, and he was a lieutenant. And at this point, you see I have question marks for his birth and death, but what we do have, he created a ton of documents for the time that he was in North America. So I was able to find his trail here, and you can see it through these dots. So he joined the Roman Catholic Volunteers, which was really interesting because he would have had to been Catholic to join this particular regiment as an officer, and he was a lieutenant and adjutant in that. But he was also a veteran of the British Army, and at the time, Irish Catholics were not allowed to bear arms or be in the British Army. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, but there was a bit of a policy where if the lower gentry of the Catholics joined the British Army, they didn't say anything about it. The problem with the Roman Catholic volunteers was they had a lot of problems with discipline and unruly behavior among the troops. They were looting as they were traveling across the states, and they ended up being disbanded a year after they were created. So Samuel Richard Wilson had quite the military career, because after he was in the Roman Catholic Volunteers, he joined the New Jersey Volunteers, who had come up. We've had that come up before. And he had problems there as well. He had problems disciplining his subordinates, and he ended up being court-martialed because at one point he hit a private soldier with the butt end of a bayonet, and he ended up being found guilty during the court-martial of over disciplining this individual. So then he's moved to another regiment called the Royal Garrison Battalion. And we're up to 1781. And the way the Royal Garrison Battalion is described is it's for worn out or disabled or those of long service. So the idea is that they weren't very useful anywhere else. So this is where they put them. So I guess that's the situation he was in. And so at the end of the war, he decided the best option would come to New Brunswick in 1783 to farm. And he kind of started off, he moved up the river. He started in Majorville and then ended up in Queensbury. He was first in Majorville. I have a picture of that, but he was basically squatting there. He built a house and started farming, but he hadn't actually had the land granted to him. And now Majorville, that was there before the Loyalists came. There was a planter settlement there already, of course, plus the Indigenous people and Acadians. Some of them had been pushed out, but there were still a few Acadians around as well. So he was forced out of his land in Majorville, and the land ended up being re-granted. And now he produced a ton of land petitions, both for himself and acting as an agent for other Loyalists as well. So he was very good at writing. I'd say he is very literate. And one of the ways I was able to track him is he had a very distinctive signature. And when I was like, oh, could this be the same person? His signature was the same throughout all of this when I found his name on documents. So yeah, he was almost acting as a lawyer, like he was almost like a natural lawyer. So he helped a lot of other people with land transactions. And then he started kind of acting as an advocate for members of the Royal Garrison Battalion. There wasn't many of them that came to New Brunswick, and they had not been granted a block of land like the Guides and Pioneers, like the New Jersey Volunteers. So he petitioned for land for the remainder of the Royal Garrison Battalion. And first he asked for St. Anne's Point, so Fredericton area, and he couldn't get that. Then he requested a survey of Scudawaskit Creek, which I've found that to be, it was Long's Creek. When the survey was done and he went and looked at the land, he decided it wasn't suitable. He wanted more and better quality land. So he ended up getting land on that same block 3 that we just talked about, that Elizabeth Green did, except on the other side of the Mactaquac arm there. And so we got 2 land grants in Queensbury. So here's one here. And then if I move the map here, so we have another one right here where you can see it's there. So this is what the River Mactaquac was there. Yeah. The interesting thing, if you look at, when talking about whether he kept the land, both of his grants were actually given to 2 parish churches to use to generate money. And so his land, he wasn't able to settle it either. And it was escheated eventually as well. So that's why his name doesn't appear on the land grant map. But he does appear on some of Sproul's maps here of the area. So he had clearly abandoned his settlement effort, by the 1790s, because other people were asking for the land because they were saying there's nobody there. But he seemed to keep some relationships with the military people that he had met throughout his career. And I kind of lose track of him about after 1787 document-wise until 1789, when he actually submits a claim as a loyalist to the Loyalist Claims Commission. And it's kind of interesting because it's one page, and he was he wasn't afraid of writing a lot, but his loyalist claim was just one page. And I'm going to flip back over to my SharePoint, or for my PowerPoint for a minute and finish off. I just wanted to show you a better image of his land claim here. So what he says in his land claim, or his loyalist claim, was that on April 1777, your memorialist, so sometimes they call petitions memorials too, embarked for America on the capacity of lieutenant on half pay. That June following, your memorialist was taken prisoner by a Boston privateer, by which accident he lost all his clothes and other property in the amount of 130 pounds. That in November following, your memorialist was appointed to a corps raised in Philadelphia that served in the same to the end of the war without obtaining any addition to his half pay or other recompense for whatever before mentioned losses. So he said he was in the same regiment the whole war, which absolutely wasn't true. He was in 3 different regiments because he had problems, but he kind of glosses over that to present the best picture of himself. And what he was basically asking for is he still got half pay from the British government. He figured because he was now a loyalist veteran as well, he should get the other half of his half pay, so get full pay for his retirement, but he was not granted that. All right, so I'm just going to finish off here. So if I've intrigued you at all and you want to know more, we are actually the library is now open for people outside of UNB just recently, so we can make appointments Monday to Friday. We also have, throughout the pandemic, have been doing interlibrary loans of all the material in the collection. So that means you can be at another library, even in Ontario, and we can send material there for short-term loans. And in-house, we can do some limited research, and we can also send material, if you arrange beforehand, to the Provincial Archives, which is right here on campus. They've been really helpful with us doing that, like if you can only come on the weekends to do research. And also, so you can reach me or any of the staff at mic@unb.ca is the best way to get a hold of us. Okay, and then I don't know if we have time for questions. I'll stop sharing.
All right.
How did I do?
Wow.
I went a little bit over time. Okay.
Oh, that's okay. It was fascinating. So, I mean, it's really hard to get all that information in, even in the time period that you did. And yeah, no, this is definitely fascinating. We have had some questions in chat, and I'll just scroll up. Chuck asked, is the 5th floor library where the records are in Fredericton? And I think you answered that at the end.
Yes and no. Microforms had been in the basement, and our newspapers are now in the basement, but the Loyalist collection's on the 5th floor, and archives and all our manuscripts, our archival manuscripts, are on the 5th floor too.
Okay. And Jillian's asking if you could provide us with the URL for the Marion Gray Audie database again. I'm not sure if you want to put that up or put it in chat. And
I don't know what view I have to be in to get the chat. Oh, there we go. Okay, I see it now. Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, great. And Heidi Good had a comment. She said, Benedict Arnold was my ancestor, Nehemiah Beckwith's business partner. Oh,
yes. Wow. Yeah. Yes, he had, Benedict Arnold had, I don't think he left a good impression on like his business dealings here didn't go that well. Yes. Yes. And one of the Loyalists I actually researched that did have some connections in Fredericton. His son, at one point when Benedict Arnold was on the American side, he actually had locked his son in a barn and tried to burn him. And I was like thinking that would be awkward if they ever ran into each other
Oh my.
in New Brunswick. So
Oh, the stories that could be told. And Brenda asks, she comments and asks, a great presentation, Leah. Are there any primary records in the collection that pertain to the Amherst, Sackville, Fort Cumberland area?
yes, we do have some, and there's been people doing research in that area. Mount A would have like the most original records on that. Like what we have is probably a copy of what's at Mount Allison.
Okay, and Brenda also asks, what are George Sproul's active dates that he's producing his maps?
I think 17, I don't know the exact date range. No, it would be the 1780s. Yeah.
Okay.
He was
Yeah.
like one of the earliest ones that basically figured out where everybody should go. Yeah.
Okay, busy guy. And I'm just going to see who's Debbie is asking, do the records about the people of this era and their ancestors and progeny ever get used to study the way land use and land ownership changes through time? And she goes on to say, properties pass through families or are subdivided and sold. Then there are changes of official government boundaries, like parishes being divided into village, town, service districts that can actually cross property lines. It's quite a long
Yeah,
question.
there's still like it's still a part of like survey engineering. Yeah, like we have engineers that still kind of need to look at the old property records to figure out, and especially if things have been in a family for a long time, to figure out property lines. And if you look at the original grants, sometimes it'd be really hard to figure out where the boundaries are, because they talk about, oh, it's at the oak tree by this creek, that's where the boundary is, and neither of them exists anymore, or they refer to like other people's property as being the boundary line. So yeah, sometimes, but I do know people do still have to go back to those original documents sometimes when they're trying to figure out boundaries.
All right, okay. And Jane just commented, excellent presentation. Can't wait to visit. And I see that you've posted the link to the Audi collection. And yes, Heidi went on to comment that he bankrupted Nehemiah by stealing his ship. Oh my. And Jane's commented that a trammel is a mechanism that lifts pots in the fireplace up and down, must be down. It works with the wheel, must have saved a lot of burnt figures. Oh.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out I was in the historical Oxford Dictionary trying to figure out what it would be, and I wasn't sure, so thanks for that.
All right. And Hadi also shares that Nehemiah was the first to navigate the St. John River and transported most of the Loyalists who came to St. Anne's Point. That would be Fredericton now. And some thank yous from Christy. And Jillian has commented, when working as a conveyancer, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, I had to draw properties based on the old metes and bounds descriptions using chains, etc. It was fascinating. I wonder if she meant maps, but if she can maybe unmute herself if that's not the case. All right, and
it's pronounced, it's working as a conveyancer, which is transferring property. So I worked for a lawyer, and those are metes and bounds descriptions. So when somebody had an original land grant, and then over the years, people would parcel off, 2 or 3 acres to this person for a house, to that person for a house, etc. And then we would have to determine what property was left and whether what was being deeded was actually the correct description. Anyway, you had to use a protractor. It was fascinating work, yeah. But that's sort of what Leah's talking about, except oftentimes the oak tree might have been gone. You have to figure it out from there. Yeah, it was really neat.
Yeah, it is hard. I found some of the community histories that have been written locally over the years. They kind of fall to that. It's like well, the house is beside where so-and-so now lives, and it's 40 years past, and you really have to do the work to find out where that house
Yeah.
was. And
The neat
okay.
thing is, though, you can still, if you look at a map of the area, like especially New Brunswick, and you go to Google Earth view, you can still see like the original property lines there, like in what different people have done with the land. Yeah.
All right. Okay. And that takes us to the end of questions in chat. And maybe if anybody has any, I can suggest if anybody has any specific questions about Loyalist ancestors or Loyalist connections, that they can get in touch with Leah maybe directly, if she doesn't mind that.
Sure. Yeah.
She can give them some help. And all right. So I think I'll end us there. And and thank you again, Leah. This is like a great presentation, and I'm always learning, and I'm pretty sure I've learned a lot today too. I'm glad it's being recorded so I can take my time to really absorb what you said. And thank you for sharing your passion about this research with us. And I hope it never stops. And I've got to take some more time to visit the Loyalist collection. And as we said earlier, we're recording this session, and you can encourage your friends and family to access it and share it if they were unable to attend, especially if they're doing research and wanting to access the documents. And so coming up in the next couple weeks, because next week is Easter, we're going to be having Roger Nason join us. And he is going to be talking about the original Peleg Trip property at 570 Trip Settlement Road and its evolution through the generations. And so again, the same time, same place in a couple weeks. And I want to thank everybody for attending and for the support of the Keswick Ridge Historical Society for putting on these speaker series. And check us out on Facebook, like us on Facebook. That's where you'll find out the latest news and events that are occurring. And we're always looking for new members, of course. And as I said earlier, so far our meetings have been held through Zoom. And if we do move to in person, it will still be a combination. We're got the technology to do that. If you have emails and want to join us, join the society, check out our email is Keswick Ridge Historical Society, all one word, @gmail.com, or message us on a Facebook page. And again, thank you, Leah, for this awesome presentation. And for everybody that's participated today and had some good questions. And I had some questions, but I think I'm just going to have to encourage myself to look up the answers or contact Leah. All right. So we'll be ending our presentation now, and have a good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for attending. And we'll see you all in a couple weeks. Remember, not next week, but a couple weeks.